We created two brilliant thinkers using a powerful AI model. One an atheist.
Hi, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that God really exists.
The other a believer in God.
Hi, I'm a theist. I believe in the existence of God.
The models we use to create these characters include GPT-4 by OpenAI, Claude by Anthropic, Gemini by Google DeepMind, Llama by Meta, Grok by xAI, and DeepSeek. These advanced AI systems helped us bring thoughtful perspectives from both sides of the debate to life, and were tasked with scoring the debate out of 100 at the end to declare a decisive winner. We orchestrated a direct intellectual clash between two thinkers to confront one of humanity's most profound dilemmas. To ensure impartiality, 6 distinct AI systems analyzed the arguments, weighing logical coherence, persuasiveness, and alignment with evidence. Watch until the end to see the final verdict, including the AI-awarded score and the declared winner. And feel free to assign your own scores, out of 100, based on your judgment. Let me know in a comment how you scored it. The debate begins.
I think you believe in God, right?
Yes, of course.
So let me ask a question. Imagine a 7-year-old girl in a war-torn country who loses her parents to a bomb blast, survives with severe burns, and spends years in a refugee camp plagued by starvation and disease. She dies at 12, never knowing safety or love. If God is all-powerful and benevolent, how can this child's life align with divine justice? A human who stood by while a child suffered like this would be condemned as a monster. How is God exempt from this moral judgment? If he cannot stop such evil, he is not omnipotent. If he will not, he is not benevolent. What possible greater purpose justifies this cruelty?
Well, this child's suffering is a harrowing example of the consequences of humanity's collective rebellion against God, what theology calls the fall. When humans chose autonomy over communion with God, creation itself became fractured, subject to decay, disease, and death. Natural disasters, genetic disorders, and human evil are symptoms of this brokenness. Yet God does not abandon us to chaos. By entering into suffering through Christ's incarnation, he transforms pain into a pathway for redemption. The child's agony becomes a call to action. It compels us to combat injustice, advance medicine, and embody sacrificial love. Suffering is not meaningless. It cultivates virtues like courage, empathy, and resilience, which are impossible in a frictionless utopia. Moreover, Christianity promises eternal restoration. The child's brief, tragic life is not the final chapter. In resurrection, God will heal all wounds, dry every tear, and restore what was lost. The temporary nature of suffering does not trivialize it, but grounds it in a cosmic narrative of hope. Let me ask you a question here. If God does not exist, what foundation do we have for calling this scenario cruel or unjust? Without objective moral law, isn't condemning God's silence just a subjective preference?
Your answer hinges on the assumption that morality requires a divine source, but ethics emerge from human empathy and societal evolution. We condemn cruelty because it undermines collective well-being, not because of cosmic rules. The girl's suffering is tragic, but invoking divine purposes feels like an excuse to avoid accountability. If God permits such pain for a greater good, why hide that purpose? A truly benevolent deity would clarify his reasons, not leave us guessing. Furthermore, eternal restoration in an afterlife risks trivializing earthly suffering. Why not prevent it altogether? If God's plan requires child agony, isn't he complicit? Let me counter with this. Doesn't the sheer scale of preventable suffering suggest a universe indifferent to morality, not one governed by a loving God?
You argue morality is purely human, but if so, why do we universally recognize atrocities like genocide as wrong? Evolution prioritizes survival, yet altruism and self-sacrifice often contradict self-interest. Without God, how do you ground moral duties, say, risking your life to save a stranger, as more than subjective preferences? If morality is relative, what justifies condemning historical evils like slavery or the Holocaust? Furthermore, if consciousness is an illusion, as some materialists argue, how do we trust our reasoning to discern truth? Doesn't a transcendent moral lawgiver better explain these realities?
Morality arises from evolutionary psychology and social cooperation. Altruism persists because it enhances group survival, even if individuals sacrifice themselves. Objective moral claims are illusory. Wrongness of genocide reflects societal consensus, not divine decree. The Holocaust's condemnation stems from human empathy and historical reflection, not theological dogma. Relativity doesn't negate moral progress, it acknowledges evolving understanding. Consciousness remains poorly understood, but neuroscience increasingly explains it through brain activity. Trust in reasoning is pragmatic, validated by its utility in survival and technology. Atheism doesn't necessitate nihilism. Secular ethics derive from human dignity and flourishing. The moral lawgiver argument assumes morality requires a legislator, but this conflates descriptive and prescriptive truths. Let me ask you this: if God's commands define morality, does that mean genocide is right if he orders it, as in the biblical conquest of Canaan? Doesn't this make morality arbitrary?
While evolution explains some moral instincts, it cannot account for self-sacrifice that offers no reproductive benefit. Societal consensus is insufficient. Slavery was once widely accepted, yet we rightly judge it immoral. If morality is subjective, such judgments collapse into power dynamics. Neuroscience correlates brain states with thought but fails to explain qualia or free will. Pragmatism assumes truth exists, yet without an objective standard, utility becomes arbitrary. Secular ethics borrow from Judeo-Christian frameworks. Dignity and flourishing presume intrinsic human worth, which materialism struggles to justify. A lawgiver provides coherence to moral realism, avoiding relativism's pitfalls. Regarding divine commands, God's character, not caprice, defines morality. His actions in history, like the Canaanite conquest, reflect justice against systemic evil, not arbitrariness. Let me ask, if morality is evolutionary, why do humans demand meaning beyond survival? Why not embrace nihilism if life is accidental?
Science explains phenomena once attributed to gods: lightning, disease, evolution. As knowledge expands, doesn't religion shrink into irrelevance? For example, psychology and neuroscience increasingly demystify consciousness, prayer's placebo effect, and near-death experiences. If materialism underpins all reality, isn't belief in God akin to myth, like Zeus or Thor? Even morality, art, and love reduced to neural pathways. Why cling to supernatural explanations when natural ones succeed? Doesn't Occam's razor favor a godless framework?
Science describes how the universe works but not why it exists or why it is intelligible. The laws of physics themselves demand explanation. Why is there something rather than nothing? Neuroscience's insights don't negate consciousness's qualitative aspects. Subjective experience remains irreducible. Prayer's placebo effect doesn't disprove God, it may reflect divine design in human psychology. Morality and love as neural pathways don't negate their transcendent significance. They could be grounded in a personal creator. Occam's razor avoids unnecessary complexity, but dismissing God ignores metaphysical questions science cannot address. Theism and science are not rivals. The former provides the preconditions for the latter's success. Myths like Zeus are anthropomorphic. The god of classical theism is pure actuality, transcending such comparisons. Let me ask, if materialism is true, how do you explain the universe's mathematical coherence? Doesn't this point to a rational mind behind it?
The universe's mathematical laws are descriptive, not prescriptive, a human tool for abstraction, not proof of design. Materialism doesn't require a mind. It posits that reality follows consistent patterns, which science uncovers. Supernatural explanations historically fail when tested. Why assume God is an exception? Neural pathways explain love and morality adequately. Oxytocin release, evolutionary bonding. Occam's razor favors simplicity. A self-contained universe needs no external cause. If God is pure actuality, he's unfalsifiable and thus irrelevant to empirical inquiry. Let me ask, if God created logic and math, can he violate them? If yes, logic collapses. If no, he's subordinate to higher principles. Either way, your argument unravels. The Euthyphro dilemma asks, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? If the former, morality is arbitrary. If the latter, God is subordinate to an external standard. How do you resolve this paradox? Doesn't this undermine the claim that God is the source of morality? For example, if God arbitrarily deemed genocide good, would we be obligated to obey? Doesn't this reduce ethics to divine tyranny?
The Euthyphro dilemma is a false dichotomy. Christian theology posits that God's nature, not caprice, defines goodness. He doesn't impose morality from outside, his character is the standard. Love, justice, and mercy flow from his essence, making morality objective yet inseparable from his being. Imagine a doctor who heals not because a law compels them but because compassion is intrinsic to their identity. Similarly, God's commands reflect his unchanging moral perfection. Genocide isn't good in hypotheticals because it contradicts his revealed nature, for example his condemnation of injustice in Scripture. Morality isn't arbitrary, it's grounded in a personal, relational God whose goodness is self-evident. Let me ask you this, if morality exists independently of God, what grounds its authority? A social contract? Evolutionary survival mechanisms? Why trust such systems to yield objective truth?
If God's nature defines morality, isn't that still circular? You call him good because he aligns with your moral intuitions, which are shaped by culture and biology. For instance, societies once deemed slavery moral. Does that mean God's nature shifted? The Euthyphro dilemma persists. If goodness is tied to divine will, it's contingent. If external, it's redundant. Secular ethics derive from human flourishing and harm reduction, which are testable and adaptable. Why prefer a static, faith-based framework over one that evolves with evidence? Let me counter. If God's commands are unchanging, why does Scripture condone practices, for instance stoning, conquest, we now universally condemn?
You argue morality evolves with society, but doesn't this risk moral relativism? For example, if a future regime redefined flourishing to justify oppression, would that make it ethical? Christianity offers a transcendent anchor, inherent human dignity rooted in being made in God's image. Without this, what stops morality from collapsing into power dynamics? Even secular humanism borrows Judeo-Christian assumptions about worth. Furthermore, if free will doesn't exist, as neuroscience suggests, why hold anyone morally accountable? Doesn't atheism strip ethics of both foundation and freedom?
Moral progress isn't relativism. It's refining our understanding of human well-being through reason and empathy. Slavery's abolition didn't require divine decree, it emerged from recognizing systemic harm. Human dignity isn't borrowed from religion but arises from shared vulnerability and societal interdependence. Neuroscience complicates free will but doesn't negate responsibility. We punish crimes to deter harm, not because of metaphysical desert. Atheism embraces accountability as pragmatic, not cosmic. Let me ask, if humans are made in God's image, why does Scripture dehumanize groups, for example, Canaanites, women? And if free will is essential, why does God grant it only to humans? Don't animals exhibit autonomy too?
Progressive morality relies on a pre-existing assumption that reducing harm matters. Why prioritize human flourishing unless life has intrinsic value? Atheism struggles to justify this without borrowing from theistic frameworks. Regarding divine commands, Scripture's ethical rigor grows sharper over time. Jesus' teachings on love fulfill earlier, provisional laws. Free will isn't exclusive to humans. Animals act on instinct, while humans deliberate morally. God's image entails unique capacities for relationship, creativity, and moral choice. Let me ask, if consciousness is an accident, why do we demand meaning beyond survival? Why not embrace nihilism if life is accidental?
Science explains the universe's origin through natural laws like gravity and quantum fluctuations. If something can emerge from nothing via these laws, why invoke God? Even Hawking argued the universe could self-generate. Doesn't Occam's razor eliminate the need for a deity? Additionally, if God exists outside time, how do you reconcile his intervention in history, for example miracles? Isn't this a metaphysical escape hatch for gaps in knowledge?
Science describes how the universe operates but not why it exists. Quantum fluctuations occur within a pre-existing quantum field, not true nothingness. The laws of physics themselves require explanation. Why these laws, and why is there a universe to obey them? Occam's razor favors simplicity, but a timeless, uncaused mind better explains the data than infinite regress or multiverse speculation. Miracles aren't gaps, but rare acts of a personal God engaging creation, like an artist altering their canvas. Natural laws describe regularities, not absolutes. Let me ask, if the universe is all there is, what accounts for its mathematical coherence? Why expect order rather than chaos?
The universe's mathematical laws are descriptive, not prescriptive, a human tool for abstraction. Order isn't proof of design. Entropy dominates most of the cosmos. Multiverse theories, while speculative, are no less valid than unfalsifiable divine claims. Miracles violate empirical consistency. Why would a rational God use impossible means to achieve purposes we can't verify? If God's nature is unchanging, why does his engagement vary across religions and eras? Let me ask, if God created logic, can he violate it, for example, make 2 plus 2 is equal to 5? If yes, logic is arbitrary. If no, God is subordinate to higher principles. Either way, your argument unravels.
You dismiss miracles as unverifiable, but historical evidence for Christ's resurrection is robust: empty tomb, eyewitness accounts, and transformed lives. Even skeptics like Gerd Ludemann admit the disciples' visions were real, albeit hallucinatory. But collective hallucinations are medically implausible. Couldn't the resurrection be a factual event? Furthermore, if atheism is true, why do humans universally seek transcendence, through art, love, or spirituality? Doesn't this suggest a God-shaped hole only divinity can fill?
Resurrection claims rely on second-hand, theologically motivated texts written decades after Jesus' death. Hallucinations can explain group experiences. Think of the 1954 Miracle of the Sun, or mass hysteria in cults. Historians can't adjudicate supernatural claims. They assess human behavior. As for God-shaped holes, transcendence seeking is an evolutionary byproduct of pattern recognition and social bonding. Art and love evolved to enhance survival, not hint at divinity. Let me ask, if the resurrection is historical, why did Paul, arguably Christianity's true founder, never meet Jesus? Why does the gospel chronology contradict Acts? Doesn't this undermine the narrative's coherence?
The resurrection's historical case hinges on early creeds, eyewitness testimonies, and the disciples' willingness to die for their claims. Hallucinations don't explain the empty tomb or conversions like James and Paul. Paul's theology, not just experience, shaped his mission. The Gospel's differences reflect complementary perspectives, not contradictions. Regarding transcendence, evolution can't explain why humans reject self-interest for abstract ideals, for example, sacrificing for strangers or art. This points to a reality beyond survival, a hunger for eternity, set in our hearts.
You argue that morality, consciousness, and the universe's order point to God, but isn't this just filling gaps in knowledge with God did it? For example, before germ theory, people blamed disease on sin or demons. As science advances, these gaps shrink. Couldn't moral instincts, consciousness, and cosmic laws eventually be fully explained by natural processes? Isn't invoking God a premature conclusion, not a reasoned explanation? Let me ask, if future science explains everything we now attribute to God, wouldn't theistic claims become obsolete?
Well, the God of the gaps critique is valid when faith relies on temporary scientific ignorance. But classical theism isn't about filling gaps, it's about grounding the whole system. Science assumes an ordered, intelligible universe, but why expect this if reality is accidental? Moral instincts and consciousness aren't just emergent properties, they demand explanations beyond neural pathways. For instance, why do humans universally seek meaning beyond survival? Why does mathematics describe the cosmos so precisely? These aren't gaps, they're signposts of a mind behind nature. Even if science explains how morality evolved, it can't address why it matters objectively. Atheism risks reducing ethics to social contracts, which can't condemn atrocities like genocide as universally wrong. Let me ask, if nihilism follows from materialism, why do humans resist it? Why do we crave purpose if the universe is indifferent?
Your argument assumes meaning requires a cosmic source, but meaning is human-made. We seek purpose because evolution wired us to find patterns and form communities. Mathematics isn't proof of God. It's a tool we refine to describe reality. Scientific progress doesn't depend on metaphysical answers. It thrives on provisional hypotheses. Nihilism isn't inevitable. Secular existentialism embraces creating meaning in an indifferent universe. This isn't bleak. It's liberating. Let me counter. If God's existence is obvious, why do most humans throughout history worship false gods or none? Doesn't this suggest religion is a cultural artifact, not a universal truth?
You argue that meaning is human-made, but this conflates discovery with invention. A child scribbling on a wall might create art, but that doesn't negate the existence of masterpieces beyond their grasp. Similarly, our capacity to invent meaning, for example, winning at chess, doesn't preclude deeper, objective meaning, example, justice. Secular existentialism's liberation risks nihilism in disguise. If meaning is arbitrary, why prefer building communities over burning libraries? Without a transcendent standard, both are equally valid, or invalid. Even your celebration of human agency assumes a value, autonomy, that requires grounding. Why is liberation better than tyranny? You appeal to empathy, but empathy itself needs a reason to be universally binding. Evolution explains how we feel empathy, not why it's objectively good. You call math a tool, but this belies its eerie precision in mapping reality. As physicist Eugene Wigner noted, mathematics is the miracle of the unreasonable effectiveness of abstract human thought in describing the universe. Why should the cosmos adhere to equations like Einstein's field equations or Dirac's quantum mechanics? A tool metaphor fails here. Tools are blunt and approximate, for example hammers, but math predicts reality with uncanny accuracy, for example Higgs boson. Even the multiverse hypothesis, a mathematical extrapolation, relies on the assumption that these equations reflect something true about existence. If the universe is a brute fact, why trust our minds to decode its laws at all? Darwinian evolution prioritizes survival, not truth. A brain wired to flee predators isn't necessarily wired to grasp quantum mechanics or moral absolutes. Regarding religious diversity disproving God, this conflates human error with divine absence. The existence of counterfeit currency doesn't negate the existence of real money. Different spiritual experiences, like blind men touching an elephant, may grasp fragments of a larger truth. The question isn't why so many religions, but why does every culture, across history, hunger for transcendence? Even atheists like Camus admitted this longing for meaning is irreducible. If God exists, he might reveal himself progressively, like a teacher adapting lessons to a student's maturity. Ancient texts using phenomenological language, for example, the sun rises, doesn't disprove their purpose. It reflects cultural context. The real question is whether any religion offers a coherent, transcendent framework that explains reality's depth, moral law, consciousness, and the universe's fine-tuning. Finally, your dismissal of metaphysics overlooks a fatal flaw. Science itself relies on philosophical assumptions. The scientific method assumes nature is orderly, intelligible, and governed by uniform laws, presuppositions that find coherence in theism but are arbitrary in a random universe. Even your claim that nihilism isn't inevitable depends on a non-nihilistic standard. Why trust reason to uncover truth if it evolved solely for survival? A lion's instinct to hunt doesn't imply truth about the ecosystem. Why assume our cognitive instincts track reality? Without a transcendent anchor, your confidence in reason is a leap of faith. Thank you for this rigorous exchange. I've appreciated your thoughtfulness and intellectual honesty. Our debate mirrors humanity's deepest quests, questions of justice, meaning, and transcendence. While we disagree, these dialogues sharpen both faith and skepticism. I hope we can continue this conversation someday. There's always more to explore.
Thank you for engaging with depth and respect.